Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the MiCEF Let's Talk Transmission podcast. My name is Chris Kerber, and I am a research fellow with the Michigan Conservative Energy Forum. Our group is dedicated to promoting common sense, market based energy policies that foster competition, diversification, and continued technological advancement. We work to reduce economic and political barriers to energy innovation through education, research, policy advocacy, and collaborative partnerships, ensuring all customers have access to clean, affordable, and reliable energy for homes, businesses, and transportation. Today, I had the pleasure of being joined by Chairman Dan Scripps of the Michigan Public Service Commission, and we had a fantastic conversation. So, without further ado, we'll get right into it. Chairman Scripps, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here.
So glad you can make it, and we're all really excited to hear what you have to say. Just to get us started, could you maybe talk about your background, your role at the Michigan Public Service Commission, and then what exactly the MPSC does?
Sure. I think like a lot of things, sometimes it's easier to understand sort of how I got here, looking backward than it ever did sort of moving forward. But really started to get interested in energy. I served one term in the Michigan House of Representatives in 2009 and 2010, represented a district that had a lot of energy assets, including the Ludington Pump Storage Facility, a lot of oil and gas drilling, some early wind and solar, just a lot of different things. And as part of that, I was on the Energy Committee, and that really sort of got me interested. And coming out of there, I worked for a clean energy trade group. I'm a lawyer by background and practiced in the DC offices of a firm focusing on sort of energy transactions. And when this position opened up, when the governor was elected and Rachel Eubanks, who is a commissioner, was made state treasurer, I applied and was fortunate enough to be chosen. And it really is where I wanted to be, because the Michigan Public Service Commission, I like to think, is where the rubber hits the road. We regulate electric, natural gas utilities, as well as have a role in telecommunications and infrastructure siting, whether it's pipelines or electric transmission, which is what we're going to talk about today. But it's the decisions, sort of how the utilities can recover their costs, what they're ultimately spending their customers' money on, and the work that we need to do to make sure that we're keeping the lights on as a state. That is the heart of what the commission does. And that's really why I was interested in joining and being part of it.
Awesome. So aside from your role with the MPSC, you're also heavily involved with the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO for short. Could you talk a little bit about what exactly that organization does and the role that you play in it as well?
Sure. Across the country, there are a number of these regional transmission organizations, sometimes called independent system operators. And they are the folks that operate the bulk electric transmission, the big grid that we think of. That's different than the wires that actually connect to our homes and businesses that are owned by the local utilities, Consumers Energy or DTE or others. It's the sort of bulk electric grid that then is responsible for dispatching of resources, of generation resources into the market, and making sure that they have the transmission infrastructure to move electrons around. And so MISO covers, it actually goes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. It covers 15 states plus the province of Manitoba and the city of New Orleans. About 90% of Michigan is in MISO. The other 10% down in the southwest corner of the state is actually in PJM, which goes all the way out to the Atlantic coast. So we're sort of situated in two, but I spend most of my time working on MISO issues.
Sure. So maybe to come back to the regulation of utilities, first, how specifically does the MPSC perform this function, and why?
Sure. So the idea, and this is actually the 150th year of the MPSC, or our predecessor agency. We were set up in 1873 as the Michigan Railroad Commission, and railroads at that time, and then over time other industries as well, were seen as sort of natural monopolies. And there was, I think, a benefit to allowing them to flourish. It helped to electrify America in the case of electric utilities. But also monopoly power is problematic. That we've had antitrust laws for 100 years in this country, and concerns about sort of the ability of monopolists to exercise monopoly power to increase rates or to reduce quality of service where there aren't other options for customers to choose between, meant that you needed to have a strong regulatory presence. And so the what we call the regulatory compact was really trying to square that in exchange for an exclusive service territory and the ability to operate as a monopoly within that service territory, they would submit themselves to state regulatory jurisdiction. And so for the distribution utilities, we regulate the terms of service, the cost that they're able to charge their customers, and a whole host of other things. Transmission companies are actually regulated largely by the federal government. So there's a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that oversees the transmission functions, because those are largely interstate, as well as the work of the RTOs and independent system operators like MISO and PJM. But the state also has a role in those as well, in terms of we have state siting authority for some of the high voltage bulk transmission lines. So even though the rates aren't regulated at the state, their ability to site projects above a certain length or higher than a certain voltage needs to come in front of the state commissions, and we've got jurisdiction there.
Sure. So when we talk about siting, could you maybe go into just a high level explanation of that process?
Sure. If a transmission owner, and in Michigan, we essentially have two: ITC, which covers a lot of the lower peninsula, and then ATC, which covers American Transmission Company, which covers a lot of the upper peninsula, as well as Wolverine, which supplies the cooperative electric utility. So it's not just two, but when they want to build a new line, if it's higher than 345 kilovolts in voltage, which is a pretty high voltage line, and it's longer than 5 miles, they need to come and get a certificate from the commission. And that allows stakeholders, property owners along the route, others to weigh in and say, is this the right route? Is this sort of the best path that project can go? So we don't have a lot of those cases, but we have a couple that are coming up as part of some of the transmission expansion that we've seen at MISO, and there's a sort of clear statutory framework for how we adjudicate those.
Sure. So when you talk about stakeholders participating, can you give us a general idea of who these stakeholders typically are, and if there's a role for the public to play in that process as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So often they're people that have stakeholders a stake in the outcome of the case. And that can be because they're people who pay the costs associated with it. For siting cases, it's often people who are impacted by the route chosen, so property owners along the route. And there are some that show up in a lot of our cases. So our staff actually is independent from the decision making of the commissioners themselves. And so they are in every single one of our cases representing the public interest, and really sort of putting a balanced view of, are the costs appropriate? Is the route sort of well selected? All of the statutory factors. We often have the Attorney General who can intervene in our cases as of right, representing the people of Michigan. So she really is an advocate for the people who ultimately pay the costs. There are business groups that regularly intervene representing their members, either generally or particularly for large energy users. They often want a seat at the table as we're deciding these. And then there are groups like the Citizens Utility Board of Michigan that represent residential interests in front of as part of our cases. But in specific cases, and particularly in siting cases, it's not at all uncommon for individual property owners or groups of property owners who are concerned about the route, or at least want a seat at the table as the proceeding goes forward, to intervene as well. And it's, it is sort of a quasi-legal process. You typically are represented by counsel. As part of the formal proceedings, it's subject to cross-examination and the development of record evidence and everything else that we need to look at under our statutes. But we also both allow for and encourage individual members of the public to submit comments that we can't base a decision necessarily on an individual comment, but it helps us to get an understanding of sort of where the public is on some of the cases that come before us.
Sure, sure. Really taking the holistic view into all the different factors.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. So to kind of shift gears here a little bit, what is up with all the talk about transmission recently? You see it on the news, you see different, everyone's talking about it. And generally, the public really only becomes interested in transmission when there's a problem, right? When the lights don't turn on, or you hear something about, like the ERCOT outage and that whole terrible disaster that was. But it seems like in the past year or so, recent months, transmission has really made the national airwaves. So why is everyone talking about it?
I think for exactly the reasons that you pointed out, that we've seen actually problems. And we had a grid scale outage 20 years ago in 1993, covered a lot from Michigan sort of east. But those are really the exceptions. And there were a number of steps taken to make sure that that didn't happen again. And largely it hasn't. But in the last couple of years, in the ERCOT outage that you mentioned around Winter Storm Uri, what we saw over Christmas this past year in terms of Winter Storm Elliott, with outages for the first time in the Tennessee Valley Authority and other places, there we're starting to, and certainly what's happening in California with the California Independent System Operator and some of the challenges that they're having with wildfires and other things. There are an increasingly sort of these grid scale outages are happening. And I think that's because of a changing generation mix. A lot of those sort of older coal units in particular, some nuclear as well, sort of getting towards the end of their lives and being shut down. A lot of additional resources being added, wind and solar in particular. And then the need to sort of move electrons around the footprint, and the way that you do that is through transmission. So I think it's really focused on maintaining reliability even as the system changes. But when outages happen, particularly when outages happen as a result of extreme weather, that gets people's attention in a very immediate way.
Sure. So I can't remember exactly when the article came out, but Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm went on the record when asked about transmission, and she said, more, more, more transmission. So why is transmission so important right now, especially when we consider the United States' clean energy goals?
Yeah, I think it absolutely helps with the clean energy goals. When you look back at some of the drivers for significant transmission build out, you saw within MISO in 2010, 2011, the development of a whole suite of projects called multi-value projects. And a lot of this was designed as wind in particularly was being added to the footprint, that you needed additional transmission because the wind resources are where they are, essentially, that it doesn't, when you look at where the wind blows best, it's not always where people live. And how do you get the energy from where it's being created into the load centers, the major cities and other places? And transmission is the answer to that. So it really plays a role in capturing sort of those resources. But two other things are happening. One is, because the fuel costs of wind and solar are free, that the more that of those resources are added, the lower the marginal price goes. And so there's a significant economic benefit from being able to capture lower cost resources, and particularly fuel-free resources, and integrating those into the energy mix. And the other thing is reliability, that even though those multi-value projects were built to move wind essentially from the west to the east where the load centers were, in emergency situations during Winter Storm Uri and other times, the grid operates almost exactly backwards from that all of a sudden you're moving resources from the east to the west, and it's the same wires, it's the same infrastructure, but it's serving a different purpose. And it's emergency situations, having those wires that originally built for one purpose, but being able to use them for another purpose, helped maintain reliability even sort of in the most challenging weather conditions that we've seen recently. So there's a bunch of reasons, but I think it comes down to economics reliability, and the ability to integrate more and more renewable energy resources.
Of course. And when we talk about integrating these new renewable resources, how does our current grid need to evolve in order to, meet these new requirements of it?
Yeah, it's something that we've spent a lot of time in Michigan thinking about, but also sort of within MISO and nationally. And a couple years ago, MISO issued a report called the Renewable Integration Assessment. There's one extra letter, but it's called RIA, and and at least three of those letters are a Renewable Integration Assessment, and it really looked what needs to happen in terms of how we sort of run the market and how we build out transmission in order to integrate sort of 50% high or higher renewables, 30% or higher. And what they found was our job gets harder, but it's doable. That it becomes more complicated as you get to increasing levels, particularly north of 30%, and then again at above 50%. But we also know what we need to do, that the level of complexity is a challenge, but it's not an unsolvable challenge. And
Mhm.
so it's a combination of sort of market dispatch, market signals for some of the attributes that we need to have, including ramping and other things that traditionally haven't been fully priced into the market. And so sort of the evolution and development of new market products within the MISO market, and then transmission. And so I think you're seeing when you sort of zoom out and look at some of the work that MISO is doing around the reliability imperative, some of the work connected with the long range transmission plan, some of the market redefinition work, all of those are designed to sort of address the increased complexity that comes with additional renewable integration. It's not an unsolvable problem, but we got to get to work.
Of course. So, aside from the role that transmission is playing in our clean energy goals, what are some of the other benefits of further investment?
Yeah, well, some of it is on reliability. I still think this is a lot of it's designed clearly to integrate more renewables, but it's also the system's changing whether we like it or not. That when you look at sort of the goals that um, major corporate players have in terms of their energy mix, they want more renewables and they want additional reliability, guarantees that the lights are going to stay on for industrial processes. And so you look at in Michigan, the Fords and the GMs and our furniture industry, some of the data centers that have been locating in Michigan and elsewhere, they've got ambitious targets. And increasingly, you're seeing that among smaller businesses and residential customers as well. And so they're driving this change. And we just have an obligation to make sure that the system stays reliable, even as the sort of generation mix continues to evolve. But beyond that, these are capital projects, they're infrastructure projects. And like other infrastructure projects, whether it's roads or bridges or whatever else, you put people to work. And these are jobs that can't be outsourced. The construction has to happen where it happens. And so there are a lot of good jobs created as part of this infrastructure build out that is designed to serve really important purposes around reliability, sort of cost-effective access to energy, and the rest of it. But it also creates an awful lot of jobs.
Of course. So, when we try and capture these benefits of transmission, how do you properly balance the benefits with consumer affordability?
I see these as two of the same things. But I will also say that the price tags are significant. So the first tranche of the long range transmission planning projects that MISO rolled out last year is $10 billion. That's a lot. Tranche two could be 20 to 30 billion, and all in it could be $100 billion. I mean, that's real money. I don't care who you are. But what you also have to look at what would happen if you didn't have that. And the truth is that could actually replace $500 billion of generation. So for 1/5 the cost, you get the same reliability benefits, you get the same sort of broader grid benefits than if you just pursued a sort of we'll just replace generation with additional generation. So really, I think the focus needs to be on optimizing the portfolio. How much generation do you need? Where do you get it? What's the profile? What are the all-in costs, including fuel? And what is the role of transmission, where you could spend some money to move that around more efficiently in a way that ultimately saves costs for customers? And at the same time, I think we also have an obligation because of the costs involved to make sure that we're sort of wringing every last bit of value out of the current system. And so we've been working on things like dynamic line ratings or other grid enhancing technologies that ultimately can maybe offset the need for some of the build out from a transmission perspective that would otherwise be needed. But that focus on cost containment is absolutely essential. Just how do you get the value out of the current system? And then as you're looking at sort of alternatives, whether they're generation or transmission, being able to view those holistically and optimize the portfolio of transmission plus generation for maximum value for the folks who ultimately pay the bills.
Sure. And maybe here it's important to take a step back. When we talk about transmission owning utilities, who pays for the lines that they build? And ultimately, how do they make a profit from them?
Yeah, it's always the customer. So it's always the customer. But that's, I mean, but I will also say when you think about living in a world without electricity, it's a value. And so we need, as regulators, we are very focused on cost containment, on sort of the reasonableness and prudence of the investments that are being made, whether the rates charged are appropriate, because it is the customers that pay, and they often don't have a lot of choice. They can't shop around like you would in a traditional market. But the way that utilities have traditionally made money is by deploying capital. And there's been, I think, a really good synergy of interest, common interests, and that they make their money by deploying capital, and we need them to deploy capital to build the system. And I think that's still broadly true. I think one of the things we're looking at in Michigan, particularly on the distribution side, is can we better align customer goals with how the utilities make money? That's something called performance-based regulation, but really trying to incent the utilities not just to spend as much capital as they can, but to do as much as they can as efficiently as possible in meeting the goals or delivering benefits to their customers. And so, but I think that's a layer on top of, like, I don't think it's you either do traditional cost-based capital focused earnings or you do this performance-based. I still think that the system that we've had for 100 years largely works. It sends the right signals, particularly at a time that we've got to rebuild our infrastructure at both the transmission and distribution level. But bringing in those customer goals, customer perspectives a bit more, and trying to align how the utilities make their money with the benefits their customers receive, I think is important.
Sure. So we've already covered a lot of ground here, and the framework you've kind of set up is there's a lot going on with transmission. So what do you view as some of the, maybe contemporary problems within the industry as we're trying to outfit the grid to better accommodate these new renewables, increase reliability, items like that?
Yeah, I think it's really sort of being clear on what we're doing and why we're doing it. And there are folks who, would rather that the clean energy transition isn't taking place, and they're worried about how much money do I have to pay for transmission. And I understand that perspective. But I also think that at the end of the day, you get access to fuel-free resources that ultimately have already are showing benefits to customers in terms of reduced payments that you need for electricity. And the change is happening whether we want it to or not. And so I continue to believe that we've got to just make sure that we're staying one step ahead of the changes. We can't have it be that as the changes that are taking place on the generation side take place, that reliability is sacrificed. It's a different way of thinking about how we move electricity around the region, but I think it's doable, and I think ultimately doing it well leads to additional benefits. And then the last piece, I think, is, we've spent a lot of time talking about sort of how this works within MISO. But one of the pieces that we've seen really operationally work and then have noticed when it doesn't is the ability to move electricity between regions, between PJM and MISO and the Southwest Power Pool, between MISO and Tennessee Valley Authority. And so I think taking a look at how do you build some of those interregional lines, interregional linkages between the RTOs and between RTO areas and non-RTO areas is going to be just incredibly important. Because if you can, the broader the map of resources that you can draw from, the cheaper the resource. that because you just allow more market entrants to participate, but also the broader map around which you're balancing, the more likely it is that the sun's shining someplace, even if it's not somewhere else, or that the wind's blowing out west, even if it's not here in Michigan. And so the more that we can integrate sort of within MISO and then between MISO and other regions, I think the better off we're going to be in terms of delivering affordable power to end customers and making sure that we're ensuring reliability even as the system continues to evolve.
Mm-hmm. And definitely that integration is very important. And I'm glad you mentioned it because it brings up an excellent question that I think you'd have a great perspective on. Could you talk a little bit about Michigan's peninsula problem, specifically when we talk about, energy and electricity?
Yeah, it's first of all, it's a problem that I wouldn't trade for anything. I love being surrounded by the Great Lakes. It is, it defines us in all sorts of ways. But from an energy standpoint, it's different than being sort of sharing, several hundred miles of a land border with the state next door. And one of the things is because we're peninsular, to get electricity into the state, you've got to go around Lake Michigan, essentially, or around Lake Huron. And particularly when you look at sort of the fact that Chicago, one of the largest cities in the country, sits right there at the bottom of Lake Michigan, it's difficult to get that low cost wind from the plains into Michigan. In 2019, as part of our statewide energy assessment, we identified increasing the ability to import from other places, increasing what's called the capacity import limit in MISO speak was one of the priorities. And we've been working on that. And I think the projects associated with the first tranche of long range transmission planning projects will help with that. We also identified sort of increasing the linkages with transmission as part of an overall reliability solution or strategy that we articulated in the fall or in the summer of last year in 2022. And have been working to sort of better understand that. We're actually being briefed later this month on some of the options to better connect not only with MISO, but also with PJM and even the Ontario independent system operator. But there's also, I think, more work that we can do as MISO continues. And so one of the projects included in at least their first set of potential lines for Tranche 2 is a line that would actually go under Lake Michigan and connect sort of from Wisconsin to Michigan. And the benefit of that line, if it were to be built, is that you don't have to go around Chicago anymore. That all of a sudden you've got that same direct path to the west and to the windier areas in the MISO footprint that other states have enjoyed. And, I don't want to prejudge the line. It ultimately likely would come before us in a siting perspective. But I will say that I'm glad that it's being studied. Because there are potential benefits, absolutely, to better linking Michigan with the rest of the MISO footprint and better linking us in a way that sort of bypasses Chicago and allows us more direct access.
Sure. And we spent a lot of time today talking about MISO LRTP. And for our viewers who might not be as familiar with that, could you talk about what LRTP is and why it
Sure.
was such a momentous step in the right direction?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier the multi-value projects from 10 years ago. This was, I think, a $6-7 billion set of projects. It was easily the largest set of projects that existed. And some of them are still pending. There's one line in particular that connects Wisconsin and Iowa that still needs final approval. So it takes a while for these projects to be built. But then for essentially 10 years, we sort of incrementally built lines as they needed to be upgraded, but we didn't have the same sort of broad-based approach to sort of transmission expansion. In 2018, 2019, the organization of MISO states, the states actually said to MISO, we need you to start thinking about this. We see opportunities around transmission expansion and we need MISO to really get in the game. And they did. They built a set of futures of what the future might look like under different sort of sets of assumptions, and then tried to develop, at least at the beginning, a set of lines that was a no regrets set of lines, that whatever the future looks like, we know we're going to need this. That was Tranche 1. And that was $10 billion. So the largest ever set of projects. And that was approved by the MISO board last year. And is in the process of the individual companies that will be responsible, the transmission owners that will be responsible for those lines, starting to develop sort of actual applications that will eventually come before the states for siting. But there's also a second tranche that they're in the process of working on right now. That will be even bigger still. A third tranche that will likely just be in the south, and then a fourth tranche that they're talking about that will better connect the whole of MISO, better connect MISO North and Central with MISO South, and really allow for that geographic diversity that can provide so much benefit both in economic and reliability terms. So it's a multi-year, multi-tranche approach to sort of building the backbone transmission that we know that we're going to need as the sort of future unfolds. And I will say, sometimes I'm wondering if MISO is going fast enough because the future is sort of arriving in real time. But there's no question that they're doing the best job of any of the RTOs or transmission operators across the country in terms of building out the infrastructure that we know is going to be necessary.
Awesome. So as we do start to look towards the future, what do you think some of the biggest maybe opportunities are? And then what are some of the largest challenges we have to overcome?
Yeah. Well, the opportunity, I think, is that, and it's sort of the most daunting challenge is this transition is happening, and it's happening faster than anybody expected. And the rate of turnover in the generation fleet, the difference in sort of the attributes that the newer resources bring versus those that they're replacing, there are challenges. There's levels of complexity in managing that transition. And we're not China and I think that's a good thing, but it means that there's no central sort of national grid planning authority that sort of makes every single decision. It's a whole lot of different private owners of infrastructure assets who are all making their own decisions based on a range of factors with sort of a limited degree of control from the grid operator or even from the states. And so sort of how we manage that transition, I think, is really challenging. But the plus side is that that the benefits of unlocking, not just from a sort of carbon mitigation, but these are they're fuel-free resources. If we can effectively sort of manage and integrate them, that there's an opportunity for real cost savings and all of the sort of benefits that go with that as well. So I think they're sort of the same answer on both sides of the challenge is the opportunity, and the opportunity sort of brings with it a whole set of challenges as well.
Sure. So as we start to wrap up a little bit here, if you had to sum it up, why should the everyday Michigander care about transmission?
I think there are two reasons. One, and I'm not the person who coined this phrase, but if you like renewables, you need to love transmission. And it really is the key to unlocking the additional renewables that 70+% of Michiganders, and that's true nationally, say that they want as an increasing share of our energy mix. But the other benefits are around reliability, that the increased linkages with the rest of MISO and across the regions mean it's much less likely that we sort of see outages at the grid scale, like we saw 20 years ago, like we've seen in Texas and Tennessee Valley more recently. And those linkages ultimately, I think, are the best defense in our ability to draw energy wherever it's being generated to wherever it's being used and consumed, even sort of at the most challenging times of the year. And so there is both an opportunity to sort of build the infrastructure necessary to unlock a clean energy future with the sort of requirements of maintaining reliability and indeed enhancing reliability even in the transition.
Sure. Well, once again, thank you so much for joining us today and telling us all about transmission. We really appreciate it. And if any of the viewers or listeners do have any additional questions about the items we talked about today, is there somewhere that they can contact the MPSC?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a whole contact us at our website, which is michigan.gov/MPSC for Michigan Public Service Commission. And there's contact information. And then if you just really want to wonk out, the MISO website, which is misoenergy.org, is a great place to start, and misostates.org for the different state perspectives on some of the issues in front of MISO are two additional great places to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the work that you've been doing for the state of Michigan and for joining us today, taking the time out of your day. We all really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Chris, and congratulations on your graduation.
Oh, thank you so much.